Alright, part 3. So I was finishing up about my study abroad in Mexico. Aside from hanging out a lot with my girlfriend Angelica, I also just hung out with a lot of different Mexicans, and it was just a really wonderful experience being able to practice my Spanish every day. One really important thing, I have some experience traveling, studying abroad, and I've always studied abroad with a group of Americans. It's really important if you're going to be studying abroad, if you're going to be traveling with your friends, for example. I think it's really important to hang out with the people that have the discipline to uh, to really to really speak the language of the country you're in. So if you're going to Mexico or Spain for the purpose of learning Spanish, then try to avoid the people that are only speaking English, because those people are going to ruin your cultural experience. I remember one time we were near Janitzio, um, which is a beautiful kind of monument town in close to Pátzcuaro. And I was with a group of Americans, and I was really interested in going and talking to the local people and finding out what they're selling in their markets, things like that. And I remember distinctly that the only thing that the Americans were interested in was going to the top of this island, which has a monument on top. Americans, a lot of times, I don't want to make an unjust criticism, a lot of times when Americans are traveling, they're very narrow-minded in their vision of what are the important things to see. So everybody wanted to go up to this island, and nobody wanted to stop and talk to the locals. So I was really angry at that time, and I think that if I could have done it again, I would have traveled more by myself or with a close partner who's as interested in the same culture. The same applied in Spain, which I'll talk about later. All right, so came back from Mexico. That was after 3 months. I kept dating Angelica for around 4 months after that, and it was a really beautiful relationship. We're still really great friends. She's one of my best friends, and I learned a lot from her. Now, around 2007, around when 2006, 2007 was my Spanish obsession period. This is a period of time in which I was back at UC San Diego, back in Southern California, and I would basically spend every waking hour practicing my Spanish. This is really interesting because this is something that is a recurring theme in a lot of the YouTube videos about learning any foreign language. Like, for example, if I saw a post by Get Real Language, his name's Ignacio, excellent channel about linguistics, about Spanish, about English. And he talked about how for a period of time when he was learning English, he would just spend a lot of time in chat rooms, IRC, things like that, and just talking to people. And learning English was not really a consequence of, diving into books and saying, I'm going to learn this English. It was actually the consequence of just interacting with people and spending a lot of time in the English-speaking world. And I think that was kind of like what I did when I was back in UC San Diego. So around that time, my interest in Castilian Spanish had really developed quite a bit. I had already started annoying my Mexican friends by pronouncing the theta, probably really badly. Around that time, I remember I was in this strange transition period between Americanized English, Mexican English, and Castilian English. Oh, English, sorry. Americanized Spanish, Castilian, Mexican, and Castilian Spanish. That's what I meant to say. And so around that time, I'm sure that my accent must have been really. I actually have some videos which I'll upload later that show that my accent at that time was kind of a strange amalgamation of these 3 different accents. principally, at that time, I'd say it was the American accent with a lot of schwa, a lot of, these typical American sounds. And around that time, I started getting more into Spanish hip-hop, started listening to different artists like Juaninaka, El Choyin, Nach, que en aquel entonces se llamaba Nach Scratch, ¿verdad? Pero ahora solamente Nach. ¿Quién más? SFDK, Morodo, Meko, lots of different artists. Spanish hip-hop scene was really coming up at that time. And around that time, I also started listening to different podcasts in Spanish. One of the podcasts that I loved and that I participated in quite a bit was Cabreados, which is basically a podcast where you would, whenever something pissed you off, you would send in an audio post, un cabreo, right? And he would post it. He would respond. And I thought it was a hilarious podcast. His Spanish was very clear. And also another podcast from Malaga was Las Cosas Curiosas. Las Cosas Curiosas was a podcast by a guy named Victor, who was a really tremendous, really amazing person. He unfortunately passed away, I think a year or so ago. And I also, that podcast was really interesting because it kind of opened the door for me to the Andalusian accent. I'm not sure how they say it, Andalusian in English. And I also started listening to another podcast. This guy's also from Malaga, by a guy named Carlos Calvente, and his name was and his podcast was named Joe Gordo. It was a podcast about losing weight. Now, I would never listen to a podcast about losing weight in English because I'm pretty darn thin. But I love this guy's accent. It was like, I don't even know how to imitate it. O sea, yo soy Carlos Calvente de podcast de Yo Gordo. Y esta vez vamos a hablar de varios temas relacionados con la báscula. Things like that. I just love that accent. So I kind of fell in love with the accent from Malaga around that time. And I also started to learn the basics of the Madrilian accent, like the La Jota, for example. And there was a gradual shift at that time, as I said, from Mexican Spanish to Castilian Spanish, and hopefully leaving behind a bit of my Americanized accent. Interestingly, it was actually a 2-week period, about 2-week period, in which I started listening to this podcast, Desde el Baño, from a woman from Buenos Aires. O sea, un acento completamente porteño. And at that time, I really loved the Argentine accent. I still do. And I learned, around that time I started speaking with a little bit of an Argentine accent, probably a very bad Argentine accent. And because I also had a friend who was from Argentina, and it was kind of like fun between us. We would always speak, and I would try and improve my Argentine accent. And I learned a very important skill at that time, which is how to aspirate the words. So like, en vez de decir aspirar, sería como aspirar. Well, that sounded wrong, but instead of aspirar, sería como aspirar. So things like that. Let's see how long we are now. 9 minutes? Alright. Alright, so fast forward to 2008. I decided to study abroad in Spain, in Madrid. It was a 1-year program. It was actually a 6-month program with the option to extend to 1 year. And I ended up extending my trip, my visit, to 1 year. I studied in Getafe, which is a city very close to Madrid. It's actually part of the province of Madrid. And I studied at the University of Carlos III, La Universidad de Carlos III. And it was really interesting because with this study abroad program, we had the choice of either living in Madrid or living in Getafe. The main difference between living in Madrid and living in Getafe, from a linguistic point of view, was that if you lived in Madrid, you wouldn't be placed with a homestay. You'd kind of be placed with a family. You live kind of like renting an apartment, okay? Which means that you would have a lot more freedom to go out and explore, maybe less curfew, less of a familial experience. But, you know, if you lived in Getafe, which is a smaller city, you would have a homestay. And of course, I chose the homestay. Why? Because for me, it was a lot more important to go out, to be immersed in Spanish and to speak it on a daily basis, to see how a family interacts, than it was to have those liberties of going out in the city and the convenience of exploring Madrid. I could still grab a train and be in Madrid in 15 minutes. But I think living with a Spanish family in Getafe was one of the best experiences of my life. Not only did I have a great host family with 2 little kids, a host father, host mother, and a host grandmother as well. The kids were super friendly. They had a beautiful German Shepherd. No, it was a collie. It was a collie. And the dad, whose name was Pedro, was a former Spanish military. He was a sapper. So his job was kind of like to place bombs on bridges and things. That's what he was trained for. This guy was hardcore. He was pretty badass. And I remember this guy, he had a very, very deep voice. Like, every time I talked to him, like, he would have this very hoarse voice. Everybody in the family, all the adults in the family were chain smokers. Unfortunately, I don't agree with smoking, but I think that Pedro was one of the main influences on my Spanish because it taught me that in order for me to learn Spanish fluently and also to distance my Spanish from, say, an anglicized Spanish with a very American accent, I really needed to change my entire tone of voice. So when I was speaking Mexican Spanish, which tends to be a little bit softer than Castilian, northern central Spanish, my voice sounded too much like my voice in English, which is actually pretty high-pitched. And so by talking to this guy, he always talked with, tenía una voz así de fuerte, todos los días hablando de varios temas y siempre decía una palabra, un par de palabras. ¿Qué ocurre? ¿Verdad? Le encantaba contar historias, ¿verdad? Historias de papá. Y nada, me encantaba su acento. Todos los días se unía a la familia, se juntaba la familia ahí en la sala y hablábamos todos. And this guy, he had this way of talking which was just so charming and so passionate that I couldn't help but adopt his accent to the best of my abilities. Alright, so we're about 13 minutes now. We'll go to part 4. Sorry this is really long, but hopefully it's useful to somebody. Okay, next part.